Well, first of all, thank you for being here in this new episode of Sin Jefes, which means no bosses in transición.coach. We're going to have an English-speaking session this time. We almost always have only things in Spanish. But for me, it's an opportunity to be able to speak with Marianne Osório and Charlie Shread. Got it right? Yeah?
Shread, close enough.
Shread. From Wandering Schools to be able to talk about their work, their wandering around schools, and what they've learned on this travel. So first of all, Marianne and Charlie, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you
for having us.
Well, I shared with you some of the questions that I wanted to make, and the first one that I use with all our interviewees are: what are the things in your life that took you to start this project, in your case, of Wandering Schools? What happened that this search of understanding different type of schools took you on this voyage around the world?
Okay. So can I start?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I was educated in Brazil. I was a science teacher in a public school. That's how I started my journey investigating more about democratic education back then. So even within the state school, I was already practicing school meetings with the students, and also working with project-based learning. So I was trying to develop different types of pedagogy, different from the traditional, within the mainstream. That was the beginning for me. And then I went to the UK to do a master into pedagogy, education. And I met Charlie there, and we realized that our paths were really connected. And in my research, I wanted to investigate two democratic schools here in Brazil. And I got to know about Charlie, that he's going to tell a bit about himself, but he was also involved in filming democratic schools. And we realized that the filmmaking would contribute a lot with the research, that he could go and collect data with me, and I could use that material later to do my project. So we realized that there was a good combination between the filmmaking and research, and also as a way to share what we learn with other people beyond our individual research.
Yeah. From my side, I'm trained as a filmmaker, and I was involved in a little documentary project in the UK. We were trying to investigate new approaches to the education system and find ways to give voice to young people so they have some participation in changing their schools. And then that path led me to Mali, I guess, and we sort of combined our skills, and filmmaking became quite a central communication tool for us in Wandering School. So we made lots of videos through our travels, and now the documentary film school circles as well. So biggest project so far.
I wanted to do a couple of clarifying questions about terminology, if I may, before we continue. And one is so you can explain to us the difference between, or also the connections between a democratic school, a sociocratic school. What are the commonalities, the differences? In the documentary, I heard a teacher say that in a democratic school, the two vital points are children having the ability to vote and organize their lives. So what's the differences? So you can share with us. You shared with me a map of sociocratic schools, but with different categories. So if you can share with us what you found of these different models.
Okay. So yeah, essentially, as Micah, one of the teachers, said in the film, a democratic school has these two main points, which is the school meeting, which is the moment to make decisions together, and there is some level of autonomy to the students to decide on their own learning process. So these are key points. And there are many different types of democratic schools. So the schools in the film, they have a specific pedagogy. They practice self-directed learning, or sometimes they call unschooling or natural learning. So it's their way of learning, that they believe that the student is in the center of their learning process. So they have this autonomy to lead their own path. But there are also schools that practice, for example, project-based learning, that have different pedagogy, and they still democratic schools because they have these two principles. And there are even schools that are a bit more traditional, but they have the school council, for example, and student voice projects. So they give voice to the students, and within the classroom, they might do activities that also engage the students in a different way, that give more voice to them. So they could perhaps be considered democratic schools as well. But traditionally, these two points are essential. And then sociocracy is a way of decision making, is a method for decision making and governance, which can be used as part of this democratic process. So not every democratic school uses sociocracy, and we know some schools that use sociocracy only for the staff, for example. So there is some schools in the US that they use sociocracy with the staff members, with the teachers, but they don't use it with the students. So they're not democratic schools. So there is this difference.
And the core principle of sociocracy is consent, making decisions through consent. And a democratic school doesn't have to use consent. It could use majority rule or some form of consensus. So yeah, that's the core in sociocracy, making decisions through consent.
Great, thank you very much. I would like to go now to the question of what is the project of Wanderers Schools? You shared a little bit your journeys and how you got together to start this Wandering Schools. Where is it now? Where is it headed? To understand what you're trying to build.
Okay, so we were both visiting many schools before we met. We were already visiting different schools, and we both had this dream to build a learning community together. That was our drive. So when we got together, we thought, why don't we continue visiting schools together and collect information for us to build our learning community, but also to share with other people that are in the same journey as us. That people that are also interested in building learning communities or change their current schools to a more democratic, humanizing education. So the project is a research project. We call it an independent research project because it just started from our individual motivation. That's been investigating mainly democratic schools and finding ways to share what we learn with other people, especially through filmmaking. So that's what the project is. And then School Circles, as Charlie said, was our main project, was the bigger project that we had so far. So it's taking a lot of our space and time recently. So currently we are mainly working on that and the distribution of the film and talking to many people around the world that have been screening the film and wanting to have conversations with us and get also some insights to apply in their own context. So through time, I think we also realized that perhaps where the project was leading us was not to, at this point at least, not to build our own learning community, but to support other people that are building their community. So now we are more in this process of sharing what we found with others.
Yeah, we've sort of seen ourselves as pollinators, like bees, all the little schools and projects, and we're kind of traveling around sharing ideas. We've been doing that role quite a lot.
And what is leading us, well, that we also went to India and collected some footage from the Children's Parliament there. So this is the next project coming up. And we also visit children parliament in Portugal. We are working a little video about them. So yeah, that's our path at the moment.
I find it very interesting, all these ideas of teal organization, of sensing, no? Sensing and responding. One has an idea and we have to adapt because the calling, no, of the organization, of the idea just evolves. And I understand this idea of the sharing. Could you share a little bit more about children's parliaments, so the people that are listening to us could understand what's the difference between a school and this movement of student parliaments?
So the children's parliaments is a project that started in India, and its core came from the neighborhood community network. So at the core of it is bringing people in the neighborhood together into small groups, groups of about 30 or so people. And this started in the 1970s in India, and by the 1990s they were focusing on children's parliaments, so using the same concept. So children in the neighborhood come together in small groups and they solve problems in their local community. And each child is given a title or responsibility to be a minister. So like the Minister for Education, the Minister for Environment, and they have a Prime Minister as well. And they basically learn about what the issues are in their local neighborhood and try and solve those issues. So that's the real core of it.
Yeah, and there are some children's parliaments also happening in schools in India. So they still organize based on the neighborhoods within the school, but the meetings is in the school. So it's also a possibility to do it like that. And now the children parliament is becoming a movement because it's spreading throughout different countries as well. So we know in Nigeria, in Portugal, South Africa, so it's growing, and there are loads of parliaments happening. It's a big movement.
And there's coming from the Indian group, they really want to organize a world children's parliament. So this is kind of like their long-term vision, to bring representatives from countries from all over the world in the United Nations.
I remember there was a talk of a youngster that participated in a children's parliament in India in a conference organized by Sociocracy for All last year, actually. And he talked about sociocracy and how they were using sociocracy within the children's parliament. Is this a governance system used in children's parliaments in all countries, or is it just in this case?
They are starting to implement sociocracy. Mainly they use sociocracy for the elections. So when they are electing the representatives, which is the prime ministers, they will go to the higher circle. They use sociocracy, and in their meetings they use some kind of consent to make decisions as well. This happens both in the neighborhood parliaments with the adults and with the children as well. So their idea is to create a new governance system that is national and worldwide using sociocracy. That's their dream. They are going for it.
Yeah, so they're trying to spread it throughout India and through the different countries as well, the principles of sociocracy.
Hearing you, I had another question that popped to my mind, and it was, democratic schools have always been sociocratic in one of the systems of making decisions, and if not, why some of these schools have turned to sociocracy as a governing tool and decision-making tool. And you centered the documentary around circles, around sociocracy, and there's an introduction, and there's one of the creators there talking about sociocracy. What's the power or the strength of sociocracy as a governing or a governance decision making and model system that you see it like powerful tool do these changes within education?
Well, I think that it basically has the wisdom of the minority, because when you're making decisions by a majority rule, often the minority is kind of forgotten or squashed to some extent, and it becomes a sort of this side against this side. And the sociocracy is really aiming to not have any sides. It's bringing everyone in a creative, collaborative process, so that everyone must come to a consent on a decision. So in that respect, it's more cohesive, it's a bit more collaborative, I believe, and more sustainable, because you don't end up with fractions. You don't end up with people that are annoyed because they didn't have their party, their group listened to. Instead, they were involved, and everyone had to be okay with the decision in the end.
Yeah, so it's inclusive. It's an inclusive process and integrative as well. So one of our drives to search for sociocratic schools was because when we were visiting many democratic schools, that were practicing majority rule, we realized that there was a lot of the time this division and conflict between two parts, but also that the majority would also vote for something that was reinforcing the status quo. That was very interesting. So for example, they would always vote for punishments because that's the way that they learn how to solve problems. So how do you bring a new idea, a new way of dealing with conflicts that is not punishment? It usually comes from one voice or a minority in that group that is starting to see things from a different way. And this new way of looking to things will always be squashed by the majority. So we were interested in finding schools that were not based on punishment, and we were curious to see if sociocracy deals with this issue that encourages the collective intelligence to emerge. And I think we saw in the schools that yes, sociocracy deals with this issue, and it was really, really nice to see that in practice.
Just a disclaimer, because I don't think sociocracy is perfect. It's still just a structure. So at the end of the day, we're all humans and we all have our dynamics and challenges, and no structure is going to fix everything. But having said that, I think sociocracy builds a solid foundation for creating more collaborative spaces.
And taking this into account, that sociocracy is not perfect, but it's very good. After watching the documentary, one of the questions that I had is, are these schools, the ones that are in the documentary mainly, I think all of them are based in Holland, in the Netherlands. They started being democratic since their creation foundation. If they were they were also sociocratic from the beginning, or they transitioned? And then the question is, how difficult, easy it was to transition, considering the status quo that we know how to do this part of the democratic by majority, and it's difficult to even envision a new way of making decisions. So what did you learn in this sense?
Okay, so all the schools in the film, they started as democratic schools using sociocracy, all of them. And basically in the Netherlands, sociocracy is a well-known governance system. So for them, we were surprised actually that for them it's such a normal thing to practice, and they were finding weird that we were interested in something that for them is so common.
Right.
Because we found around 12 democratic schools using sociocracy, and we know that there are many more. They're not democratic schools, but using sociocracy as well in the Netherlands. And that's because the method started in the Netherlands by Shread, who appears in the film. So he created a method in the Netherlands, and the Sociocratic Centrum Netherlands has been spreading the ideas around the country. So there are many organizations, schools using it. And in the Netherlands, there was a school called eDevice. It was actually a collective of schools in 2000, and private democratic schools, very similar to the ones in the film. And they were all closed at some point. But these new schools in the film, they emerged based on that movement, and they already used consent decision making. So when the schools emerged, they already had very clear in their mind that they wanted to use consent decision making, and so that was in their foundation, which is different from schools that are being transitioning. And we've heard of many democratic schools that use majority rule. They're now interested in practicing sociocracy, but we still need to follow them more closely to see how they are doing the transition. But it seems like they face a challenge to make the initial decision, that is to transition to sociocracy. Then you have a dilemma. How do you start you need to make a decision maybe through majority rule to decide that you will practice sociocracy.
Yes.
So
it's a contradiction with wanting to transition to a new system, isn't it? You have to use the old system to decide to transition to the new system.
Yes, of course. And of understanding that in the Netherlands, it's something that is much more common, let's call it. By difference in other countries, it's not so much known, the system of sociocracy. One of the challenges you just mentioned, have you detected any other challenges that other schools around the world that you've visited or you've interviewed have faced in this transition of governance system?
Let me think. Oh, I think they always raise that question: how do we transition to sociocracy now that we already have this majority rule? I think one of the there are some concerns that they have with sociocracy. They schools that we've seen that have some resistance to sociocracy, they wonder how much the minority will kind of dominate the decisions, and if the decision will get stuck because of this minority group that didn't consent with the proposal. So there is this concern to start implementing sociocracy. That's what we notice. There's some resistance still.
Yeah.
We've been reflecting about this idea of transitioning in the school that I was sharing with you. And there's several, I'm going to call them fears, no? Of rethinking the way to work. And one of them is, okay, if this is going to be horizontal, because people hear sociocracy or any other of shared governance system, and they think about horizontal organizations, no? Everybody is in the same level. And I view sociocracy or holacracy as a system of, there's a hierarchy of circles, but it's not horizontal. No? Not all decisions are the same. They just are different levels with different purposes, aiming at the same big purpose of the organization. One of the fears is, if everybody has a voice, how are we gonna make, how our decisions are not gonna take forever to make, and two, how to keep control. There's always this fear of losing control. No? And also how our parents are gonna take it. No, and more in a school that we're a mixture of ideologies, ideas of how a school should be run, and you've got all kinds of ideas around the families and then the teachers, and then there's a fear from the school of saying, will the families accept it, or they'll just run away from the school thinking this is not for us, no? Which is always a possibility, saying, well, this is the school, if you don't want it, there's other options, no? But these are some of the fears I hear in this idea of transitioning in our school. What would be your reflections about that?
I have some thought, which is, Well, firstly, not everyone has to make the decisions about everything. So it's also about compartmentalizing based on aims. So you have, okay, what domain of responsibilities do we have? And you have small groups that organize around those domains of responsibilities and have some level of autonomy within that specific domain. So, for example, if it's the garden, you might have like a circle that gathers around the garden. And they have responsibility around looking after the garden, for example. But that doesn't need the entire school to make every decision about that necessarily. So that's kind of like one step.
And also to make the transition, there are many ways to organize the structure. So I think it's also about the group to find a good enough structure that they feel comfortable and safe enough to try. That's also the principle of sociocracy. So how do we start in a way that we all feel safe and, you know, that is good enough to try? Because, for example, you can still have a traditional school and start implementing the circles within the classrooms with the students and start making decisions around what affects that classroom in particular. So that wouldn't radically change the whole structure of the school, but that would definitely have an impact on every student and teacher in the school. So there are many different ways to start implementing, and I think it's about each school identifying how it could work for them if they really want to try sociocracy.
I think also can take a look at the 4 fundamental principles of sociocracy and see how those principles could be applied in different areas of the school. For example, there's the circle process, or speaking in rounds is one of the principles. So you could ask, well, how could we apply that principle? Could we speak in a round instead of everyone shouting over the top of each other to solve a problem?
Yeah, so there are different elements from it that you can withdraw as well. And I was also thinking there is a misconception that the film actually didn't help overcoming, but actually reinforce this misconception that a school that practices sociocracy has to look like the ones in the film, which is not true. So a lot of the fear that comes when we do the Q&As with the people, they think that to practice sociocracy you have to practice that pedagogy as well, which is not true. So it doesn't require changing the whole structure of the school. It doesn't require changing the whole pedagogy of the school to start implementing sociocracy as a way of governance. So I think that's important to highlight.
And I'll link it with the question that I had, like how governance affects pedagogy, you know, and vice versa in the schools that you've visited. You know? I find it very interesting that you say this. It doesn't have to, but it might. So what are your learnings around this?
Yeah, so we always highlight the difference between the pedagogy and the governance as these 2 fundamental pillars, because we like to highlight that you can implement the governance system of sociocracy without changing the pedagogy if that's what you want to do. But what we see is that a school that is concerned with students' autonomy and empowering the students, if a school is concerned with that, they will naturally choose to change both structures. So they would choose to have a democratic structure for governance and a more democratic pedagogy or progressive pedagogy, that because they are coherent with each other. So both connected and centered around the development of the student. It's centered in their autonomy and their learning process, instead of a teacher telling them what to do in a traditional way, you know. So definitely the pedagogy and the governance, they are related to each other and they feed back into each other. But we also see them as separate, because you can change one and not the other. So
yeah, like for example, there's some schools that use sociocracy, but just with the adults, just with the staff members, but they don't involve the children. So it shows there's a kind of a disconnection between the governance and the pedagogy. Because if they involve the children, then it's now becoming more of a democratic school.
Yeah, of course. Before going to my last question, another question pops up on my head, and is in the documentary, there's a couple of small interviews with parents. And I kept wondering what type of families of parents, and if, because there can be also a disconnect from school, no, and the family environment, no? But I suppose that the types of families are really inspired by these principles, and they take the children to these schools, no? Or they find at these type of schools an environment that is much more better suited, no, for their children. For example, the couple of children that you interview at the beginning of the documentary, no, that there were difficult children, no, conflicted children, but they find their space, they find themselves within their spaces. So just how is the connection between families within the system in the school, no? How do they participate? And if it's a special type of profile of families that you have to have for a school like this one.
It's an interesting question. Well, it's a funny one, because in the film, yeah, we show a lot of students that were not happy with the traditional schools, and actually a lot of them developed anxiety, depression, stress, and they were actually with serious health problems caused by the traditional school. So the families were families that were seeing the suffering of their children, and realized that that wasn't working anymore, and they had to look for alternatives. And all the schools started with families that were in this situation, and they wanted to create a new school that would fulfill the needs of the children. And we usually hear this question when we are in Q&As. People ask us, so you only have problematic children in the schools? And we say, no, the schools are problematic, and they didn't manage to fulfill the needs of the students, so now they had to look for alternatives. So the problem is with the mainstream education, is not with the students, right? Still, there is this challenge that I heard also from a school that I'm very close to here in Brazil. So they are also a democratic school, and they share with me that unfortunately for them, there's a lot of families that go to this school because they don't have any other alternative. So they don't see their children fitting any other school, and then they go to this one which is more inclusive, that is accepting students that were suffering from traditional schools. But not necessarily some families that actually believe in the approach on the pedagogy, in the approach of learning necessarily. So they raise that as a challenge that they face. But still, what they share with me, that there are some families that are really proactive and really engage and align with the vision of the school, and there are families that are suffering from the mainstream, and they just find those schools as an easy option for them. So there is both, and I think that is a challenge that the schools face, to actually make sure that the families are aligned with their vision. Yeah.
I'm talking about the problem is not the children, but the school system. My last question is, why in the context of climate crisis, now coronavirus, and other global challenges that every human being starts suffering this eco-anxiety I was listening to, no? Anxiety?
Eco-anxiety.
Anxiety, exactly. And how this fear of things are just getting worse, no? And also for youngsters, like, what's the future if it's going to be like this, no? Ever more growing, bigger challenges. So is this liberation of education, is it important? Is it urgent? Is it both? What's your reflection about that? Should all schools be sociocratic, democratic, and it's just really important to do this work for the future of the world.
Okay, so for Wandering School, we've been searching for schools that practice what we call liberating education. And what we define as liberating education is based on the approaches of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator and philosopher. So the way that he describes a liberating education, it's about consciousness, is about becoming aware of the world. So becoming aware of the climate crisis, of coronavirus, should be part of the education, should be an essential part of becoming aware of what's happening with the world. And that not necessarily happen in many schools that we visit, because when you have a self-directed education, maybe the interests of the children won't lead them to that direction. But the education that we've been looking for and that we've been calling liberating education should be concerned with those issues, because should be about becoming more aware of the world and engaging with the world, doing research and finding ways to act locally as well. And that's why we were also interested in the Children's Parliament that Charlie mentioned before.
And an emancipatory or liberating education, at its core, would be democratic as well. Democratic in the sense that it's participative, so students engaging in their local community, in the world around them, so they gain consciousness through action as well, through realizing, oh, there are global issues and we should act, and that is part of the education.
Yeah, so the democratization of school, it's an urgent topic right now, and because we're also facing a democratic crisis in the world as well, right? So how do we change our organizations and our communities to become more democratic? I think that's a urgent question for us to answer. So not necessarily sociocracy, but how do we make it more democratic? Democratic as a wider concept, right? That everyone has a voice and can participate in that community. So
yeah, and I couldn't agree more on this idea always of this generational changes, no? And starting from schools, because we're facing bigger challenge also in organizations, being it non-governmental enterprises, government, where if you want to transition those organizations to something different, it's challenging in an adult, no? We've got all this baggage from our past, and it's difficult to see another way. But if we start from children, it might be much easier, no? Because they'll be searching both for those type of organizations in an adulthood. So I think it's, in that sense, is working at all levels, no, to make these changes in this new consciousness. So Marianne and Charlie, I just wanted to thank you very much again for your time. It was really nice chatting with you and being able to share this interview. Thank you again, and greetings all the way from Mexico to Brazil.
thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much for
Alan.
the conversation. It was lovely.
Thank you very
Great
much.
talking to you.
Yeah, to you too. And I'll share all the links to Wandering Schools, obviously, to the documentary, and some of the references you've made to Children's Parliament, Paulo Freire, obviously, always a great inspiration. And thank you very much.
Thank you.